No, we will start it. My name is David Brooks. I have two jobs. One which takes 70% of my time is being a columnist at the New York Times, and the other which takes 80% of my time is working at the Aspen Institute for something called WEAVE, the Social Fabric Project. This is our pin. And we are based on the idea that the core problem in this country is social isolation, and that around the country, millions of people are solving it. And so we want to know, how are people building community? How can we learn from their example and nationalize their effect? Now, what I wanted to do just in 10 minutes here was shift the focus inward. We have a tendency to talk about community and social capital as if it's this sociological thing. And we are in the most emotionally avoidant city on the face of the earth. So we tend to feel more comfortable going there. But so my introduction to social capital came in 2013 when I was going through the worst year of my life for a lot of reasons. Kids had left home, the political movement I was a part of had fallen apart, my marriage had fallen apart, and so it was an emotionally rough time. And one of the things I've learned from that time is you can't pull yourself out of those times on your own. You need somebody else to pull you out. And so I accidentally got invited to a dinner by an opera singer I knew up in 17th Street in the Crestwood neighborhood. And there was a couple named Kathy and David who had a kid at Wilson Public High School. And that kid had a friend whose name was James. And James' mom had some health issues and some drug issues, and often they didn't have a place to stay or eat. And then so they said, well, James can stay with us. And so that James had a friend, and that kid had a friend, and that kid had a friend. So I went over there for the first time in 2013, and there were 15 kids living in the house and 40 around the dinner table. And I reached out I met some kid there for the first time. I'm in the hallway, and I reached out to shake my hand and greet him. And he says, we don't really shake hands here. We hug here. And I'm not the most huggiest guy on the face of the earth, but I've been going back every Thursday night for 5 years now. And what that table, every group has a technology of convening, and for them it was the dinner table. Every Thursday night, around the table, we go around, say what we're lucky for, say what's hurting, and then we just share. And we really come to know each other, and the kids turn at you, they have a complete intolerance of social distance. So they turn at you longing for love and affection and community. And I took a friend there named Bill Milliken, he created an organization called Communities in Schools. And he came to that table and he said, I've been doing youth work for 50 years. He's about 75, I guess. And I've never seen a program turn around a life. The only thing that turns around a life is a relationship. And I took my daughter there and she walked out and she said, that's the warmest place I've ever been on earth. And so kids just show up for each other and they show up for us. And one of the girls named Madeline, her kidney failed, and David, the father figure in the family, gave her a kidney. And it's just like a family. And so that was the thing that sort of lifted me out. And those people are everywhere. As part of WEAVE, the Social Fabric Project, we've gone around the country looking for weavers. And they're everywhere. We stopped at a place, Wilkesboro, North Carolina, you find 25, 30 of them. There are only 2,000 people who live there easily. You go to Houston, Chicago, we found them everywhere. And they've all done a few things. And what was interesting about them is they had a lot in common. First of all, they tend to be stickers. They had found their geographic place of land and they decided to stick there. Met a woman named Aisha Butler in the Englewood neighborhood in Chicago. She was moving out because it was so dangerous in that neighborhood. And as she was moving out, she saw two little girls playing with broken bottles in an empty lot across the street. And she turned to her husband and said, we're not leaving. We're not going to be just another of those families that leaves. She had no idea what to do, so she Googled volunteer in Englewood. And now she runs a community organization there. A guy named Mac McCarter, he runs an organization in Shreveport, Louisiana. There are 250,000 people in Shreveport, Louisiana. 55,000 of them volunteer in his organization. He's on every block with a community, really a neighborhood block association, weaving the fabric of Shreveport block by block. Some of them, people we've met, have had horrible backstories. A woman in eastern Ohio whose husband killed their kids and himself. And she told us, I grew from this experience because I was angry. I was going to fight back against what he tried to do to me by making a difference in the world. He didn't kill me. My response to him was, whatever you meant to do to me, fuck you, you're not going to do it. And she's living a life of service, weaving community. And so these people are everywhere. Some of them run programs, some of them don't. We have a friend named Trabian Shorters who lives in Miami, and he was meeting a woman who was working as a crossing guard outside of an elementary school. And he asked her, "Do you have time to volunteer?" She said, "No, I have no time for volunteering. I don't volunteer." And he said, "Well, are you getting paid for this?" She said, "No, I'm not getting paid." And then what are you doing later in the day? "Oh, I'm going to the hospital. I bring food to the sick." And so everything she did was volunteering, but she didn't consider it volunteering because it was just what you do. The word altruism wasn't invented until the 19th century because first you had to invent the concept that we're selfish creatures before you had to invent a word to explain what we do when we're not selfish. And so this kind of activity is out there and happening. So two of the things that it needs, first, we need to shift the culture around their example. Relationships, which is what these people build, don't scale because they take a long time and they happen one by one. But norms scale. If you can shift norms, you can really shift behavior very quickly all at once. So in the 1960s, suddenly it wasn't cool to be old and a conformist, it was cool to be young and a rebel. And norms shifted. And so one of the goals of Weave is to try to hold up these weavers, synthesize their values, and shift the culture around the values they have. And that's one of the things we try to do. The other thing you need is a platform of information. People have to have a place where they can actually get to know each other. And it's been exciting for us to actually find this platform. And I only went on Nextdoor last week, and I'm now checking it every day. And Nextdoor, as Sarah will explain to you, is a place where people can physically come together. Well, first mentally come together, and then physically come together. But I just want to end on the note where I started, that this isn't about sociology, with all due respect to the sociologists in the room. It's about affection. It's about creating connection between people and building affection for each other, and then creating affection to your place. One of the most inspiring people I've met on this work was a guy who just lived in Youngstown, Ohio, and he just loved his town so ferociously that Youngstown is under assault economically. So he just went to the town square, held up a sign that said, "Defend Youngstown." And he was going to do whatever he could to defend Youngstown. And just finding the platform was the next thing he needed. So let me introduce Sarah Fryer. Looks like I'm introducing a video.
Oh, Sam, I have a question for you. Would you be my neighbor? Would you be my neighbor?
Gladly.
Because you're going to love this next one, because this really speaks to you. Nextdoor is the social networking site. Oh, Sam, I have a question for you. Would you be my neighbor? Would you be my neighbor?
Gladly.
Because you're going to love this next one, because this really speaks to you. Nextdoor is the social networking site that wants to make sure you can do and use it in times of emergency or simply when you need a recommendation with your neighborhood. Nextdoor CEO Sarah Fryer will join us in a moment. But first, please take a look at this. We're going to meet a woman who used her local Nextdoor page to get to know her new community and then felt inspired to help others connect all across this great country.
I may have posted a slightly worried message on Nextdoor.
In True TV's I'm Sorry, Andrea uses Nextdoor to feel safe. Today, 190,000 neighborhoods across the U.S. are connected on Nextdoor, building a community online and off.
I always love to welcome you and then tell you who is going to sit at the table with us.
Sarah Harmeyer relied on her local Nextdoor page after moving to Dallas in 2012.
I only knew 2 neighbors at the time, and I wanted to get to know my community.
Sarah's idea to break the ice, break bread with her neighbors.
Come in. I think I was expecting maybe 30 people, and over 90 showed up.
She didn't have enough space in her house, and so she just said, "Dad, build me a table." The saying, you build it and they will come, and they did.
Something ignited in my heart that day. I realized people just want to be invited. So I kept at it.
It was a recipe for success. In 2013, Sarah turned her passion for gathering into a business, selling tables to inspire other soon-to-be hosts.
I physically deliver every table myself. Hello! We have over 200 tables across the country now, and I feel like they're my family.
Thank you, Sarah, for bringing joy into our lives and helping us build community around our neighbor's table.
I think people would think we're in the table business, but we're really in the people business.
And in Sarah's backyard, it's not about what's on the table, it's about who's around it.
She welcomes people, she makes sure people are seen and heard, and she just sets the table for you to be comfortable.
People are hungry for connection. When you sit around people at the table and you start laughing and sharing stories, you realize you're more alike than you are different.
Good things happen when you lean over a table and share a meal with people.
Cheers. Cheers.
Cool. Okay, so I much prefer to tell the Nextdoor story, actually through the stories of what happens with folks like Sarah, who epitomizes everything that we stand for. So I've been blessed to join the company actually in the last 3 months. And what Nextdoor stands for is we want to make sure we bring together neighbors, we want to empower neighbors everywhere to build stronger local communities. Every word in there matters to us. Neighbors, we think, is the fundamental building block of how you do grassroots change. Everywhere speaks to the fact that this is a global phenomenon. So today we're in 8 countries. We're well on our way to 10 right now. And it's important because often people feel like, well, I'm on Nextdoor, I'm in my community, and they have no idea that this is actually a powerful global movement that they're on. And it doesn't matter where you are, right? You could be a family in North Korea, Crimea, Iran. I'm picking all of the axes of evil, supposedly, on purpose, because there are people like all of us who are moms, potentially of teens, who are worried about how are their kids going to grow up, and they want to come together in a community way. And so I think this is something we can take to a global stage. The stronger local communities is very important because the interesting thing about when neighborhoods come together is often you don't know your neighbor, right? You have proximity to them, but you often don't know their name. So unlike maybe other networks you might join, you have no way of finding out who is that person across the street or just down the road or over the hill. In addition, you want to feel informed about what's going on in your neighborhood. And that could be just from a community building standpoint. It might be from a commerce standpoint. So I love that Sarah's dream turned into an actual business. And we know that when local businesses thrive, communities thrive. And then the third big reason we see people on our platform is more around crime and safety. So we have 5,000 public agencies, so the local police department, the local fire department, the Met in London, the largest police force in the world, uses Nextdoor every day to get their beat policemen out there just talking community. And one of my favorite stories is Captain Husted in Sacramento, so near where I live, who started something called Caught in the Act. And so there'd be this big post on Nextdoor saying, caught in the act. So of course everyone's like, oh, I have to read that. And it would be a picture of a kid maybe picking up a piece of litter or just someone doing something nice in their community. And I love that juxtaposition of we imagine that the world is a worse place, a more evil place, there's not a lot of good going on, and yet the reality is no, there's lots of good going on. We just need to show people the path. So finding the Weave project within Aspen has just been such a coming together of folks who stand for all the same things. In the end, the empowering, we're just a platform. Like if neighbors don't decide to do things and really take it further, it doesn't matter what we do, we're just a technology platform in the end. It has to be grassroots, and that's what I loved about the idea of finding great examples of folks who are natural weavers, who are bringing together social fabric. So David told a little his personal story, and I think stories are really powerful. So I may sound American, but I actually grew up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. My parents still live there, my family is still there. So as you can imagine, it was a community that was under a lot of stress and duress. And so it was even more important at that point in time that you had community activists. My mom was the local nurse, she was the midwife, so she has a story for everyone about the day they were born, because mostly she helped birth them in some farmhouse, in the middle of the night. And my dad was the personnel manager of the local mill, which was the whole reason why our village existed. And so what I learned at that early age was there was always a knock on the back door at night, and someone needed something, and my parents were always there for them. And so again, in full circle, it feels amazing to now be able to take a platform that hopefully scales what my parents stand for and stood for all those years, but to be able to now see it come to a much broader part of the globe. So with that, I'd love to welcome up onto the stage two folks plus David. So Mark Dunkelman is first up here. Mark is the author of Vanishing Neighbor. And really, it started out, he talked about his story a little earlier on. We did a great kind of coming together of community folks in Ward 6, so I'm learning my way around DC. And Mark talked about how he had walked his dog for 5 years up and down the same stretch, and yet didn't actually know anyone on that walk, had never really said hello to a single neighbor. He's also done some amazing research. I quoted him, I think, last week at an event where he talked about in, I think, 1995 in Chicago, there was a heat wave. There were two neighborhoods side by side, I think South and North Lawnside. And in one neighborhood, 6 times as many people died during that summer, that heat wave. And as they researched the why, a lot of it came down to the fact that one of those neighborhoods had a library where people met and often talked to one another. And so when times got really tough, they knocked on each other's doors and said to that potentially senior, have you had enough to drink today? Can I bring you some water? Or they checked in with the family with young kids. And look at the difference. 6 times as many people were saved, is how I like to think about it, when community came together. So such a delight to sit on a panel with Mark to talk about this whole trend. And then Latoya is going to come up. Latoya is the founder of Brick and Story. She was so kind to open up her network earlier to us and bring together an amazing group of community activists, public sector, a whole crew of people to talk about just both the good and the bad, frankly, of how neighborhoods are either coming together or finding reasons why neighborhoods are fragmenting apart. And Latoya's story is also one of focus on community, focus on neighbors, but also bringing back in things like commerce and starting her own business. She's an entrepreneur in her own right, and I have a special place in my heart for female entrepreneurs, so keep doing what you're doing. So with that, I think if David's going to join us, we're going to move to the panel discussion. Thank you. I'll go over here.
Thank you. Mark, let me start with you. You became famous, or at least I wrote about you a lot, when you had a concept of middle and inner ring and outer ring. So why don't you just explain the concept and why what's happening is happening.
Yeah. So the basic concept of my book, The Vanishing Neighbor, is that if you organize your entire social universe along a diagram that looks like the rings of Saturn, where you're the planet, and people you know are all placed on one of the rings, with the most intimate being in the innermost rings, and people becoming less intimate to the point with the Starbucks barista that you ordered a latte from and you'll never see again in the outermost ring. And you have to place everyone you know in those rings. 3 things I think have happened over the last 50 years. The first is we've been given the opportunity, and we've taken the opportunity to invest more of our time and attention in the innermost rings, so that your most intimate contacts, your spouse, your children, your parents, your best friends, people that you text. It turns out that texting, which we think of as this technology that allows us to keep in touch with lots of people, most texts are with a very narrow band of people who are your inner ring contacts. Second thing that's happened over the last 50 years is we've invested much more in the outer rings. So these are people with whom you have a single common interest. So I like to say to people that I am one of 17 Cincinnati Bengals fans in the entire world, and we all know each other. Those are outer ring relationships, because I don't know those people more than what they post on Twitter or Facebook or whatnot. The third thing that's happened, because we all only have a certain amount of time and attention, is that the time and attention we used to devote to what I call the middle rings, which are people who are familiar but not intimate, people with whom if you bumped into them on the street, you would know something about their family, their kid was struggling in algebra, their parent was sick, whatever it is, that you'd be able to ask them about something more substantial than the weather. Those relationships have withered because we're investing more in the inner and the outer rings. And so I think the reason that I was invited to join this panel is because those are, in many respects, the sorts of relationships that the Weave Project is interested in highlighting and nurturing. And they're really, of all the platforms that we have now, technology platforms, we've got Twitter and Facebook that are really outer ring technologies. We've got inner ring technologies like texting and maybe Snapchat. Nextdoor is sort of unique. Maybe there are a couple of other people that are focused on this, but it's a technology that is focused on trying to build middle ring relationships. And we can go into this later in the panel, but I think that this shift away from middle ring relationships have all sorts of ripple effects. Why politics is polarized, why entrepreneurship is down, why the social safety net is failing. And so attempts and thoughtful attempts to try to rebuild these relationships or try to find what the utility was in them, why they were valuable, is incredibly important.
Let me just push you out just on that one point. Presumably your inner ring is filled with people just like yourself, and the middle ring is filled with people who may have voted differently, may look differently, and to draw the line out to polarization.
So you're right that you generally don't learn more about politics from someone in the inner ring because you know them so well, and they love you implicitly. And if one's a Trump supporter and one's a Clinton supporter, you're probably not going to have that argument every night at dinner. In the outer rings, where you're also invested, those are people whom you don't know their politics. If you're just doing a transaction with them on eBay, or you're both Cincinnati Bengals fans, you're not going to have that conversation. And if it turns out that you do have a difference in politics, you're less likely to maintain the relationship. The middle rings, it's unavoidable, right? These are people who you know at the PTA, or they're also parents in your kids' soccer league or whatever it is, and you need to figure out some way to maintain that relationship. And the depth of that relationship makes it so that when it turns out that they have a different point of view on politics, you actually explore it. You don't turn away. You don't write the sort of snide thing that you see on Twitter all the time. You don't unfriend them. You maintain that relationship. And so it's through the middle rings that you begin to meet and understand people from across the political divide. And it's in those sorts of conversations where you meet someone who's a Trump supporter and you just can't believe it, or you're a Trump supporter and you meet someone who's a Clinton supporter and you just can't believe it, that you begin to say, I don't agree, but at least I can see that point of view. It's not crazy. And so, you can sort of imagine these sort of conversations in a coffee shop where you've got a liberal college professor and a small business person, and the two of them have just very disparate interests. And in a middle ring relationship, that is a window onto a different point of view that is acceptable. It allows you to believe that your representative in Congress ought to reach out across, that that people ought to work together rather than just castigating each other on the Senate or the House floor. And so if that's happening, all across the country in people's lives all the time, and we're having fewer and fewer middle ring relationships, we are going to send political representatives to Washington or to the state capitol or to City Hall who are being given essentially different operating instructions, which is be polarizing, be angry, fight to the last drop, compromise is apostasy. And that's a big shift, but that's a shift that starts not with the people that we elect and not with the big institutions of government, but with the sort of ordinary, everyday, mundane interactions that we have or choose not to have in our own neighborhoods.
Now, LaToya, you do a lot of things.
I do.
So I have trouble keeping them all straight. So describe your main thing.
Sure. So I'm the principal and founder of Brick and Story, which is a consulting company I founded a little over 2 years ago. It's a bit of a merge of my own professional background in urban planning, along with some marketing, business development. But kind of going back to the urban planning core, the primary focus of the company is thinking about how are we talking about the built environment? How are we telling the stories about what's happening in the built environment and understanding the built environment is made up of the people who inhabit it? How are we being intentional about how we talk about those interactions, how we talk about the spaces and places that we're developing and how people respond to those places or interact in those spaces or interact with each other in those spaces? So a lot of my work is in the realm of community building, community engagement, dialogue facilitation. I do a lot of work with developers, with architects, with government agencies to really think about, in particular, how are we talking about development and neighborhood change? How are we talking about how people are impacted by that process? How are we talking about how people are relating to each other in that process, particularly as we're seeing the fabric of a place like Washington, D.C. continue to change over time.
Could you give us some professional tips? So gentrification is a gigantic fact in this city, especially and now coming to the other side of the river. Can you describe just how you walk people through that, how you filter them into the conversation, how you structure those things?
Sure. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing with the New Communities Initiative at the Deputy Mayor's Office for Planning and Economic Development, because I think that's actually a pretty real-life example to answer that question. So for those of you who are not familiar, the New Communities Initiative is a neighborhood revitalization program focused on 4 neighborhoods in the district, and it's largely focused on 4 areas where there is very low-income and dilapidated housing, and turning those into mixed-income communities along with one-for-one replacement of those low-income units. And a lot of what we've been trying to do in our engagement work around those sites is thinking about how are we not just engaging with residents who live in public housing or other substandard housing, but how are we also looping in the neighborhood into that conversation? How are we getting rid of this massive wall that traditionally exists between public housing, which if any of you have looked at an aerial view of public housing developments, they tend to be very segregated, like physically, from the things around them. How do we start tearing down those invisible walls where you have folks living in these isolated communities and you have the neighborhoods just changing around them, going through this own little microcosm ecosystem? How do we start tearing those walls down and start having conversations not as these little segments, but as one larger community? How do we start to shape identity of what that community looks like, and not just by the people who are coming into those neighborhoods for the first time, or maybe who've been there in the last 10 years, but also the people who've been there for the last 40 years, particularly when we're looking at neighborhoods where there's very real economic change, economic mixing, but also racial change and racial mixing starting to happen. How do we start to bring those folks together? A lot of the work that we're doing with NCI is focused on those intentional spaces that we try to design, whether it's very intentionally designed dinners where we are coming with focus group questions and we're bringing people from various walks of life in a neighborhood around the table for some curated conversation. Or it's a pop-up on a street corner where we are asking a common question we like to ask, which is, what does it mean to belong here? And this idea of belonging and who belongs, and how do we start reasserting that idea that everyone belongs, everyone has a place, everyone has value. So a lot of it is, one of my colleagues earlier this morning at the talk that we had mentioned the word intentionality, and that's really what's at the root of a lot of community building, is that sense of intention. Community building is a really hard space to work in, and it's funny because it's hard because when I think about the difficulties in it, it's largely around people's resistance to change. Like, change is probably the scariest thing for most of us as human beings to comprehend. And so in the work of community building, we're not necessarily combating good people and bad people. We are combating people's reactions to change, and those reactions are what come out as good or bad or negative or bigoted or whatever words you want to attach.
Now, Sarah, your life has an amazing circularity to it that you come back to this issue that you were born into. And I want to throw out a lot of things and give you a chance to answer any way you want. But one of them is where the place you were born or grew up in with the Troubles, that illustrates some of the downside of community.
Yeah.
And when community is not managed well, and a lot of tech platforms turn down pretty fast. I was wondering if Nextdoor faces that, or if Nextdoor steers, or what you've learned about community building that surprised you just in the months you've been in it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question because you're right. Northern Ireland has actually very strong communities. It's just those two communities don't talk to each other ever if they can help it. And I always joke, there's that wonderful good fences make good neighbors. We won the Olympics of that in Northern Ireland because we built walls. We were good at that. Bad topic, I realize, in DC these days. Bringing it back to Nextdoor, I think our learnings have been, first of all, the neighborhood has to be founded by a lead. This technology thing that some phantom person from the sky is going to create a technology neighborhood, that is just malarkey, right? You need a real live human being who typically is a community activist. They tend to be very civically engaged because it's in their DNA that they decide to take the time, and they're looking for a platform, though, that gives them some scale, some ability to talk broadly to the community. So that was number one, is that we founded the idea of Nextdoor through leads. So leads even draw the boundary. So for example, my next door neighborhood crosses a town boundary because it's more interesting to me who lives along the full street than it is whether they live in one town or another town. And in fact, the rest of my town lives on the other side of a bigger freeway, and I'm kind of less interested in them, although they're moving out on my Saturn rings. They're there and they're important, and I go to school with a lot of them, or my kids go to school with a lot of them. But really, letting the lead draw the boundary was number one in importance. I think the second thing for leads was then giving them some tools to look for what are the things that spark a community to actually start to live. Because the first is inviting people. And again, we wanted to make that easy because most people join our platform because they don't know their neighbors. So unlike a social network where maybe you join and the first thing they ask you is, can we access your address book, right? And they do that scary tech thing on the back end where you're like, what the hell is that? And suddenly all your friends are getting emails. We can't do that because you actually don't have, we're like Mark walking his dog. He does not have the email address or name of anyone in and around him. That's why he's coming to the platform. So we mapped that for you, but actually the secret became the sending of a postcard, like a physical thing. So you actually get a piece of paper in the mail that says, Sarah Fryer at Winding Way would like to invite you to this to Nextdoor neighborhood. And so we kind of again try to make it about you. It's your community. It's not our community. And then from there, it's how do we share some best practices, some of which we do through a leads forum. Others we try to do even at a more meta level. So we, for example, have found some calls to action work better and start to transcend neighborhoods. So we did a call to action in the UK called Combat Loneliness. Now, it came about because in the UK, there are almost 6 million people who effectively put their hand up and said, I'm suffering from some form of anxiety or depression. And a lot of it is actually in our younger generation. It's heartbreaking. The kind of 16 to 25-year-old generation right now has got the highest tendency to depression, anxiety, and ultimately suicide. And in the world of the most connected generation ever, right, that should feel deep connection, they feel no connection to kind of humanity, and it's gut-wrenching. So we started a campaign. Theresa May has many problems on her plate right now, but she started a ministry for loneliness. She actually put a minister in charge of that portfolio. And he was kind of like, great, what do I do now? He found Nextdoor, and we started a neighborhood challenge. And it was just a good example of something that started on the platform, but then transcended it. So you started to see people say, I'll take the challenge, which was to spend 1 to 2 hours per week, so not a lot of time, doing one thing that you thought could combat the loneliness of a neighbor. So it might be taking a look around and seeing a senior who maybe lost a spouse or something during the year, just knocking on their door and saying, hey, do you want to come join us for dinner? Or do you want should we have a cup of tea together? It's very British, they have tea, not coffee. Or it might be the single mom and just saying, hey, you kind of look like you've got a lot on your plate. Could I bring you over dinner tonight? Or whatever it is. And suddenly we saw that really take off in the UK. It jumped over the channel to France. They have something right now trending called La Porte est ouverte, so the door is open. So they've gravitated to it. So again, it's how can we take a platform, this is why I'm so interested in Weave, and can we make it kind of jump so it becomes something that transcends neighborhoods into the next neighborhood and the next neighborhood, so that people almost then at a meta level feel this like I belong to this thing called weaving, right? A great example in the last few years, I don't know if you all took the ice bucket challenge. Do you remember the ice bucket challenge, right, where you threw an ice bucket of ice over yourself? It was kind of crazy. Everyone in my neighborhood did it. It became like probably the best thing that could have happened for Lou Gehrig's disease, right? I think that it combated. So how do we create that sense of neighborhood empowerment? But it has to be led, again, comes back to it has to be led by people doing real community activism. It can't be led by technology.
Yeah. I wanted to push on one thing. You said that it's sparked by leaders. And you said leading is in their DNA. That can't be the total answer. So what do we know about leaders?
Yeah, it is kind of fascinating because there is definitely something about them, though, that almost feels genetic to me, which is why I say in your DNA. But we definitely, like what I see common when I talk to our leads is often they have gone through something very powerful in their lives. Like you talked about that awful example of the woman who lost her husband and her children. So they have often had a moment of crisis, and their way out of the crisis has been to fight back. I'm going to fight back with good. So that's certainly one story I feel like I hear quite commonly. The second thing is they're just these hyper connectors too, right? They are the node in the network. I always look for people like that. When you want to organize anything, you kind of have to hop around. I ask you, you're like, oh, yeah, it's kind of interesting, but you should talk to Jane over here because she's amazing. Jane's like, oh, you should talk to Tom because he does everything. And after about 3 hops, you'll find these hyper connectors. And then I think the third thing they do is it comes back to, I think, of what it's like founding and growing a company. They tend to have tremendous tenacity and grit. They're never despondent. They're very optimistic. And they'll just keep trying things till they find that thing that works, and they just won't let anyone say no to them.
We found they just assume responsibility.
Yeah.
Some things in the town, they assume responsibility. The phrase we heard a lot was radical mutuality. We're all equal. None of us are better than anybody else. We're all broken. We're all walking together. And they often had walkout experiences where they worked in a corrupt system which didn't work, so they walked out, created something new. Latoya, you're a weaver. Why'd you go into this?
Why did I go into this? Gosh, so much of what you just said sounds so familiar. So I had been working in the real estate space for about 12 or 13 years and had become, I think, frustrated by a number of things. I think I was largely, I think from a professional standpoint, I was very interested and had been toying with the idea for a while about trying to, number one, ideally find a job where I could kind of play in this space of community building and storytelling and working directly with the folks who have the most impact on our built environment, which are largely developers and government agencies who are building new developments. And then I realized I couldn't find a company that did it, so I started my own. And that's pretty much how it happened. But also when I look back at the trajectory of the work that I was doing, whether it was for developers or architects over the last decade, I was generally always attracted to firms that were doing very mission-driven work. So there was a lot of commonalities that I started seeing over time. I was always interested in development projects that sought to get to some greater good, whether it was affordable housing or public libraries. I was always looking for a greater good opportunity. And I think it naturally evolved into Brick and Story, which for me has just become this pretty crazy and awesome engine where it's a bit of an experimental space to try out new ideas. But it's also this really awesome space where I get to meet and converse with other people. And I'm starting to find over time that a lot of people are talking about community and what community means and how to get back to the ideas of community that I think many of our parents or grandparents had naturally instilled in their own lives and in their own neighborhoods that somehow we've gone astray from over the years.
Okay. I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll go for the group. But it's to you, Mark. Tell us where we are as a country. When you're with weavers and you see something like Nextdoor, you just get so uplifted because you really are seeing community genuinely built. And even on where I live, my next door, there's somebody doing yoga with a bunch of people. There's somebody with where do I get Middle Eastern, blah, blah, blah. And so there's just a lot of things happening constantly now going through my neighborhood that I didn't know existed. And so you get uplifted. And yet when you look at the suicide rates, that's still going up. Mental health problems are still going up. Polarization, tribalization seems to be at least stable, maybe getting worse. So how do you survey the whole landscape and what gives you either hope or sends us into the pit of despair?
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you're uplifted by Nextdoor because if you go on Twitter, it's a very different story.
Yes, that's true.
So you have to pick your platform. It is an interesting sort of tale of two Americas that are living really right on top of one another. Because you're absolutely right. We've got several social indicators that suggest that, broadly speaking, certain communities are really suffering, and yet at the same time, we're wealthy, we're more prosperous, some say we're more secure. Maybe we are, maybe we're not. So there is this remarkable sort of fundamental disagreement in our own minds about where we are, which I think is authentic. The interesting thing about it is that we've been talking, particularly sort of to focus on polarization for a second. We've been talking for a long time, for basically a decade, since the guy named Bill Bishop came out with a book called The Big Sort, which was arguing that Americans with different political views were moving into neighborhoods that were more monolithic, and that this was a growing problem. And in fact, that is true. But what I've found so interesting about it is that the definition that he used in his book for a neighborhood that was, or a community that was largely polarized, was a 20-point margin. So one candidate would get 40% of the vote, and another would get 60. And that meant that 2 out of 5 people living in that community were actually voting for the other candidate. So you look in places that are broadly conservative or broadly democratic, and you'll find there are people that live in those communities that voted for the other candidate. And the real distinction is not, I think, that we are that we're living amongst people who have the same point of view. It's that even among the people that we're living, we're not talking to people who may have them. So that these middle ring relationships are this window into the world that we don't see. And by that standard, certainly it seems like the polarization in Washington is worse. Worse still, and just as sort of the last point, about 6 months ago, Chris Bale, who's a sociologist at Duke, did this really interesting study where he surveyed Twitter and found people who were consistently conservative and consistently progressive. And he is the theory that our being in filter bubbles had made it so that we were more polarized. He inserted into their feeds points of view from the other side, with the idea that that would pierce the filter bubbles and people would become more accommodating to the other side. And what he found, to everyone's horror, was that, in fact, if you put a Democratic message into a conservative's Twitter feed, that conservative became angry and became more conservative. A little bit less so on the left. But it was sort of a remarkable discovery. And they've been talking about what the implications of this are, and should we be changing what we feed people to get them to reach across the aisle? But I think the fundamental takeaway from this is that we aren't getting the information. Our view of the world isn't defined by what we see on Twitter. It's defined by what we see on Twitter, what we see on Nextdoor, what is happening in the newspaper, what we see in our everyday lives. And the real distinction is not that we've got these new inputs. It's that we have excluded the sorts of points of view that our grandparents and our parents had normally, because they were meeting people at the PTA meeting, at the coffee shop, in the course of their everyday lives. And that sort of diversified our points of view, and that's the shift. And I think that it's terrific, and I think as Sarah rightly points out, Nextdoor has created a venue where these people can come together. And the next challenge is, how do you actually spur them to connect there?
Yeah, it is harder. But there was something stuck with me. I saw someone speak last week, so I'm stealing a line. But he said it's harder to hate someone when you're looking at them eye to eye. And I think this is why we need to get this push to physical interactions. Because I'm not sure that vitriol stands when you are standing face to face with someone.
Okay, questions right here.
I have a question.
I think we have a microphone coming up.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Abraham Walker. I'm in the Kingstown Nextdoor, so I'm a lead there. So my question is, I guess it's 2 parts. One, in my Nextdoor, I noticed that most people are posting stuff about dead cats, dead dogs, or like dogs doing things in public. And so what I did was, I guess like a year ago, I just started to shift the conversation to be more, there's a bakery here, there's a hamburger shop here. And that started to work. And so I started to see some of my neighbors out in public, and they start to comment about this, this shift in the conversation. Because I don't have animals, so I don't care about them like that. But what I did notice was that most of the meetups that were occurring offline were really focused on women meeting up. And so I I guess I'm lonely in the sense that I run my own business, and so just being an entrepreneur is just like it's a lonely gig. And so I was thinking to myself, I was like, man, I wonder if there's more men that are going through this same challenge, because I also have kids too. And I noticed that in the PTA is kind of a women-ran organization. Our kids' soccer things are like women are,
Yeah.
like the dads are kind of on the side, just
So we got to pull you guys.
yeah. And so I started like a dad's group, like I guess like 2 months ago, where I was just brainstorming. I was like, hey, guys, would you all, would the dads like to meet up at a coffee shop? And like there were like several dads that messaged me, and then there were also a lot of wives that were messaging me saying like, my husband needs a friend. So
I got one too.
Yeah. Well, I just got a message today too. Then somebody's like, "Please let my husband come." And so I'm going to be leaving early because our meeting is tonight at 6 at a coffee shop, and I just would like to see, I guess, more of an emphasis for the guys, because there really isn't that. I don't think that men are naturally inclined to want to get together. And I don't know why that is, but I just know that when I talk to men, because I'm outgoing, because I'm an entrepreneur, so I talk to people, and when I talk to them, I realize that a lot of people had friends because of his proximity. So in high school or college, but then once you got married, you kind of separated yourself from some of those other individuals.
Yeah.
Is that general that women are more active?
I mean, the answer is yes. I think even before Nextdoor, one of the founding books that we all read and our founders read was Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone. And in that, he actually talks a lot about the research that show that women are inherently more community builders. They send more greeting cards. They make more international or long-distance phone calls. So absolutely, I think there is something there, whether we like to gender stereotype or not. I also notice on the platform that women tend to love the platform. Our net promoter score is very high with women, and it's actually quite low with men, and it's a recent insight or discovery that I'm really like head scratching on. Part of it is I think we've not done a great job today, and we're always learning, on really how to prioritize what you're deeply interested in. So another part of coming on a Nextdoor platform is we really make sure that you are who you are. You live in this house. We verify you. We send that postcard. We ask you a lot about your interests, but I don't think we've done a good job of giving you back kind of a more personalized experience. So it's funny you mentioned dogs. It is the #1 interest on our platform is dogs. 10% of the people who tell us about interests say dogs are it. But I, like you, am not really an animal lover. I grew up on a farm, so to me, dogs work and they're lovely, but they're meant to be outside. They do not smell good in the house, and so I'm less interested in the dog thing. So I think part of it is how do we provide more, just generally. This isn't just again about a technology platform. How do we create social ways for I think men to come together who often are maybe less active in the community. And then also, I mean, everyone should speak on this topic. I think just men generally aren't as good as maybe that reach out moment of I need help or I'm lonely, because it's, again, our expectations for our boys and hence our men is very different about kind of getting their feelings out there. And so I think that's a societal thing that we need to fix.
Yeah, I would concur with that just from the community building standpoint. Thinking about a number of small support groups or cohort groups that I participate in or lead, getting men is always a challenge. It is always a challenge. And I think it is something about whether there's a comfort level in men. I think it's less about relating to other men. It's more about owning up to the fact that they might need a space to relate to other men. So kudos to you for actually kind of stepping out and saying, hey, I'd like to get some dads together, because I think there's a big shyness factor, a bit of a pride factor that most men have. But the irony of it is that when you get some men into a space, they talk and they gossip and they converse more robustly than women sometimes do. Right, very catty. So it is the question of like, how do we draw men in? And it's a continued challenge in community building for sure.
Okay, maybe we'll just go straight back here. That way.
Hi, I'm Marla Blow, and I'm curious about one of the things that you raised about mixed income living, right? And if I think about the ways that we are stratified as a society, I feel like income has got to be one of the most sort of, we just don't, like living in mixed income neighborhoods is like a radical thing to even be saying out loud, let alone actually doing. So I'm curious about how that's going, right? And you've been in real estate, so I think about whether there's active resistance or if it's just sort of passive, and what stories you hear people telling in this, in your business, in your consulting arena, about why and how that keeps happening, right? And whether or not the replacing like for like with lower income units is actually working, and how you keep yourself going.
Sure, yeah. So I think to the first point, the mixed income housing model is happening nationally, and it is still very much a work in progress. I would say we're probably even still very early in seeing like what the long-term impacts are going to be. But that said, the push to do mixed income housing development is largely a response to how housing development has been done in the past. I mean, I think we've all come to an understanding and agreement that obviously the public housing as it's been done in the United States has been an abomination for a long time. And we've ended up not just with a few people, but with generations of people who are in need of so much right now. And it's not just an economic thing, it's a social thing, it's education, and the nature of the housing just exacerbates that. So to the second part of your question, it is hard work working in neighborhoods around mixed income development because there are the various assumptions that people have around what does it look like. There's the various assumptions that people attach to who is going to move there, what are they bringing into my home, and this really is kind of like the crux of when we talk about community building, and a word that I raised earlier today was this idea of value, and how do we start seeing the inherent value of the people around us, and the fact that at the end of the day we all pretty much want the same things. Like we all want to be in healthy housing, we all want to be in safe communities, we all want to ideally have a good relationship with a neighbor regardless of what we look like or how much money we make. And so that continues to be a challenge because we are constantly combating both the passive and the active resistance. There's the stuff that you will see on a message board or on Twitter, or even just in how someone's body language engages or does not engage with someone that they pass on the street. But then there's the more active protest as well. There's in DC, for those of you who are here, it's not uncommon that there's many cases of mixed income housing redevelopments that are being appealed. And that is stalling the production of not just extremely low income housing, by the way. It's also housing for those folks who are out in the audience who might make $60,000 a year and $70,000 a year, who can't afford to pay $1,600 and $2,000 and $2,200 a month in rent, when you may just want to try to pay $1,000 or $1,100 a month. It's really hard to find an apartment in DC at that price point. And so the whole idea of mixed income housing is, we really are trying to cover that whole spectrum of need. And the resistance that we're experiencing, I mean, it's really delaying the production of those lower and moderate income levels of housing options on the market.
Yeah, it's something where I think social capital is interesting too, because one of the things I find about neighbors is it actually doesn't matter if you are Bill Gates. If you can't find me the babysitter that I need for Saturday night, frankly, there's different ways of thinking about the wealth or the value that you bring to a community. And I'm thinking a lot in my head about how do we do that where people can accrue social capital, or the idea that I'm a good neighbor, right? When I respond, you can see Sarah recommended 4 things in just the last week, or Sarah is like one of our, double star neighbors because she regularly, does XYZ in the volunteering sphere. So just ways to recognize something beyond material wealth, right? Which is another thing I think has really skewed our world and definitely this country.
Let's go in the back there, Carlos.
Hi, Gail Wadsworth. Yeah, when I was in the work world, a lot of interaction and socialization went on because you spent so much time with other people there, and it was encouraged. recently I went back to the place where I had been working, and it was like a bombed out city. The empty cubicles, there were very few people there. And it was because most people were teleworking. And I asked a couple of the younger people, I said, well, how is this impacting your interaction with the other people working? She said, well, we don't know them. And she said recently they'd had a retreat and they were asked to share personal information, and people didn't want to do it because they didn't trust these people because they didn't know them. So I'm just wondering if any of you are noticing any differences because people are being separated out at this point and not developing relationships that they then might continue on throughout life.
David, you haven't spoken either. Put you both on
one of the things it's important to focus on is institutions. I have a friend named Tim Carney who just wrote a book called Alienated America, and he had he was with his kid somewhere in the area, I think Silver Spring, and he had to rush the kid to the hospital. I can't really remember why, but he'd forgotten his phone, so he couldn't call an Uber. So he's running into the hospital. He gets in the hospital. The kid's okay, and his friends start coming over to him, and he realizes that all the people who came, he knows them because they have some common institution. They go to church together. They work together. They have the school together. It's not just random friends. They met through institutions. And so as institutions, it's institutions that create friendships. And I find two things about the workplace these days. The first is that, and this is the cliche among every executive I've ever met, is that people under 30 want to bring their whole self to work. They want work to provide not only their money, but their whole sense of moral purpose and meaning. And so I think that hunger is really there, as well as the second thing. I'm going to add a third. The second thing is an intense fear of each other politically, that they'll say something wrong. And so I was with an executive of a company called Brat, which markets videos to young girls. He said, and all his employees are under 30. He said, if it's 100 in a room, they all say the same thing. If it's 2 in a room, they all have different opinions, because they're not afraid that somebody may object. The final thing I'll say, I do think this telemarketing of working from home, and I'm aware of this as much as anybody. Until I took this Aspen job, my median shaving time was 5:30 p.m. So I would write, and then I'd have to go out to dinner somewhere, so I'd shower and shave. And when you arrive at dinner with shaving cream in your ear, then you know that's either a good life or a bad life. But it was isolating. And then the second thing that happens, and if you sneak past security here, you'll see our offices, is open floor workplaces, which decrease social interaction, even though we didn't expect that. But everybody just puts in their headphones. And so I do think some of our technology is working against some of our desires, but the desire for a complete emotionally enriched and spiritually enriching workplace is an overwhelming thing you sense. I don't know if any of you, final words from anybody.
I'll just quickly say, there's a certain irony as well with the workplace when you think about the evolution of co-working spaces that have started up. Particularly, I'm the other person who's like 5 o'clock shower. So I spend a lot of time in my home and a lot of time in my home office. But then you think about co-working spaces and how it's not only attracted entrepreneurs, but even some of the folks who might have a home in their company, but they would almost rather pay the fee on a monthly basis to go telework from a place that has beer on tap and has unlimited coffee and has TVs and allows their dogs to come run through. So it's interesting. I think there's a very strange changing dynamic of what the understanding of the workplace means, and it's not even being replaced. It's more like an addition. I'm very curious to see how the co-working model continues to play itself out, because it's still a relatively new concept, but it is growing by leaps and bounds. But I'm very curious to see what it does mean ultimately for the future of traditional office environments.
In other parts of Aspen, probably certainly at other think tanks in Washington, there's a conversation going on right now about the crisis of American entrepreneurialism. That we're having fewer ideas, that millennials are poised to be the least entrepreneurial generation in decades. And there's a conversation about that topic, and on the left, people say, well, it's because we haven't invested in STEAM education, we haven't invested enough in R&D. On the right, there's a conversation, there's too many taxes, there's too much red tape. And what's interesting is that if you look inside companies, you talk to CEOs and whatnot, there is a sort of a general acknowledgement that the key to having an entrepreneurial company inside is to get people from different pockets of the company interacting with one another. There's a sociologist at the University of Chicago named Ronald Burt who did a study of Raytheon, and what he found was that people who spanned what he called structural holes, meaning they have 1 foot in marketing and 1 foot in production, were at greater risk of having a good idea. And what's interesting is that even as that is considered sort of well known within the world of management, we haven't applied it to the world, sort of the society at large. And so that you've got people who are increasingly balkanized, only talking to people who root for the Cincinnati Bengals, and certainly not the Pittsburgh Steelers, but you know, aren't talking to people who are who are actually into yarn and weaving, aren't talking to people who have different interests, and that good ideas naturally in the general course of American life would emerge if people were having more conversations. So, you know, even though, you know, when Steve Jobs took over a canning factory in Oakland, he built it so that people had to walk down the hallway and pass each other on the way to the bathroom. This is something that he learned from Bell Labs in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, where the most innovative company of the 20th century. But we haven't yet applied that wisdom to the economy broadly. So I think that not only is, you know, Nextdoor and Weave important just for political purposes or for the health of the community or how to figure out these very trying challenges of integrating people who come from different backgrounds, but there's a sort of an economic component of it as well, and that if people knew each other through the middle rings and were interacting more frequently with people who had completely different points of view, we'd all be better off.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap there. So thank you, Mark, LaToya, and Sarah. And you should have on your chair or around you little bags with these lapel pins. We hope you will take them. We hope you will wear them. We hope you'll find somebody you think is a weaver and present it to them with great bravado. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.